Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and I'm so glad you've joined me this evening for one of our lovely stories. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. The unorthodox houses in this green leafy neighbourhood in Washington state were clustered together rather tightly, like liberated nonconformist old friends, wearing their individuality proudly, like badges of honour. For many of the bohemian houses in this prepossessing street represented an illustrious period in our American history. In truth, it was almost as if they perceived in their own right that they could proudly boast in their pioneering individuality and uniqueness. For no two houses in this free-spirited, eclectic mix on the street bore any resemblance to the other, which was why many people chose to live in this richly diverse environment, especially artsy, creative types who chose to live in houses that reflected their quirky personalities and originality. It would seem the vibrant, rather beguiling mix of Victorian, Queen Anne, colonial, craftsman, ranch style, houses in circa 1950s and 70s blended in seamlessly with more modern architecture, so that old married new, as if weaved together through the fabric of time with one golden thread, and it really worked quite beautifully, giving the neighbourhood an awe-inspiring, interesting edge. If you were opening up a history book, and in one street you were led on a journey from the 1800s to the 21st century, this would be one of the streets you would choose to walk down. If you ambled down the thick concrete paving slabs, under the generous canopy of the honey locust trees that framed either side of the asphalt road, you could study the different houses, like distinctive pieces of artwork in an art gallery, and truly appreciate their charm and eccentric characteristics that set the street apart from any other. Mr. Owen Rochester had been living in this green leafy neighbourhood since he was 30 years old, when he and his wife Dorothy had bought their house here for a mere song over 50 years ago. In those days it had seemed like a lot of money to exchange. Today people would describe such a purchase as costing mere peanuts. How times had changed. The Rochesters had taken a loan to pay off the house, and for a while they had struggled with the monthly instalments. But the sacrifice had been so worth their while. These days, houses like the stunning, charming Queen Anne-style home that the Rochesters resided in would fetch a tidy fortune. Who knew that the roof over your heads would one day become your greatest investment? For when the young couple arrived in the neighbourhood as first-time property buyers and caught sight of this Queen Anne home, they knew they had to buy it. It was an unrepressed purchase, spurred on by an unquenchable nostalgic whim, fanciful impulse, and callow impetuousness that two people in love just could not resist. The couple had never regretted their impromptu, devil-may-care purchase, and had thoroughly enjoyed living in this idyllic setting, where they'd laid down roots and settled down so happily as a family, adding 2 children to the mix. Indeed, over the extended period of time they'd lived together on this street, the elderly couple did not feel any different to how they'd felt 50 years ago. Well, not really. Mr. Rochester would admit that with advancing age, he was not quite as fit as he used to be in his younger years. His wife, Dorothy, complained tirelessly that her knees were causing her pain, and it was likely she might be needing knee surgery in the not-too-distant future. It would seem for the Rochesters time had slipped through their fingers like butter, but the telltale signs of the years could be easily seen on their weathered skins, where the road maps of wrinkles on their faces revealed 2 lives very well lived. Over the years they had witnessed firsthand the dynamics in their street shift, changing exponentially. It didn't look like the street it had been 50 years before. If anything, it was far more beautiful. So much had changed, as the towering trees had flourished, grown and matured, their roots settling comfortably into the ground, huge boughs reaching up into the skies with a lofty pride. It would seem people's yards had blossomed and flourished without restraint, from the sumptuous trees, exquisite rambling foliage, plants, shrubs, roses, perennial flowers and bushes that furnished people's yards, so they looked as if they'd always belonged there, while houses on the street had been fastidiously renovated and painstakingly restored, with no expense spared, and brought back to their former glory, so they gleamed with an opulent resplendence. Yet despite all the obvious transformations over the years, one thing that had remained an ever constant had been the big drawing card for the Rochesters all those years ago, which had prompted them to buy the property in the first place. It was the thick, luxurious thicket of national forest that fringed the houses on the right-hand side of the street, where Mr. Rochester and his wife, Dorothy, lived. The richly wooded area was protected land, open to the public with fabulous hiking and equestrian trails, alpine meadows, waterfalls and streams, and it always made the couple feel as if they were living in the countryside, with the benefits of suburbia only 20 minutes away by car, if the traffic was good, that is. Over the years, the Rochesters would simply open the door to their white wicker fence that fringed the backyard of their property, bordering the national forest. They could leave their house, enjoy the benefits of embarking on one of those fabulous woodland hiking trails the couple would do regularly, not only for the benefits of enhancing their fitness levels, but for the pure pleasure of exploring the luxurious forest with its towering Douglas firs, spruce, ponderosa pines, alpine flowers, shrubs and ferns. Such inspirational, invigorating, but leisurely trips soon became perennial events, and were only minutes away from their front door. "It's something about the trees," Dorothy had told her husband. "When I'm walking among the trees, all my troubles seem to fade away, like the dye in a pair of jeans, as if they don't matter at all. I then realise that in the grand scheme of things, anything I worry about is simply a blot on the landscape, and nothing more. If the birds of the air don't worry about where they will nest, or the squirrels don't worry about their stash of acorns for the next coming winter, who am I to worry about anything at all?" she would say. The couple had wistfully named their Queen Anne house Smashed Apple Cottage, owing to their small apple orchard in the back of the property, regularly frequented by hungry deer. It had been the ideal home to raise a family, and both the couple's children, Kimberly, now 53, and Reginald, 56, had long since left home, but both of the Rochesters' offspring had confessed that they had had enviable childhoods, for they had felt swathed by the loving arms of the natural world herself, but at the same time had not been deprived of the modern conveniences offered by suburbia. Both of the Rochesters' grown-up children were now living in Tacoma, Washington. They remained in touch with their parents regularly. Both of them had children of their own, so the Rochesters boasted 6 grandkids between the two of them. Owen Rochester described living on this street with a sumptuous yard that overlooked a large forest as like having acres and acres of land at the back of your property, superbly managed by someone else, so all the maintenance is not your responsibility, but you clandestinely felt it was an extension of your own property. Dorothy Rochester had been particularly fond of the deer that had regularly visited their backyard in the early morning and late evening, and had grown accustomed to them foraging under her apple trees for any of the dropped fruit in season. Let's just say over the years a plethora of eager new people had invested property on the street, paying ludicrously exorbitant prices to own one of these magnificent marvels, as many people were encapsulated by the charm that the street embodied, like a collage of different colours and textures that drew you right in, like a fish biting the end of a fisherman's line. Let's just say the national forest behind the houses was a big drawing card for nature lovers, so married couples, young families, elderly couples alike, now proudly owned property on this street. It was common to hear children's voices screaming happily as they rode their bicycles down the long grey ribbon of asphalt, tinkling their bicycle bells. Then you could observe people out and about, taking a leisurely morning stroll, or walking their dogs with or without a leash, depending on how well trained they actually were. Without a doubt, it was a peace-loving, friendly community, where people were on convivial terms with each other, and everyone knew who was who at a glance. On this particular morning, the street remained stoically still. The trees did not twitch, for there was no breeze blowing at all, but a soft congenial sunlight that belonged exclusively to this early spring morning had audaciously pushed the cold weather of former weeks aside with a firm, demanding grip. The pretty sunlight twinkled across the small open front yards of people's homes, many that were brightened with the addition of spring flowers blooming out of planters and in flower beds. For when spring arrived, the garden centres and nurseries were ablaze with the buzzing activity of eager gardeners from the neighbourhood, determined to bring a splash of vibrant colour into their homes, as they took great pride in their showy appearances of the front yards, and in some ways there was a cloak and dagger competitive spirit abounding among the residents as to who had the most beautiful yard on the street. No one said as much, but it was so poignant you could actually taste and feel it. This blissful morning would have been almost perfect if the peaceful tranquillity had not been so abruptly disturbed by the unwelcome appearance of a dark funeral van parked outside the Rochesters' residence. A few curtains in the neighbourhood twitched, as many people were quick to notice the ominous-looking van that wore gloom like a halo around its bonnet. It would seem hearts sank, as you unequivocally knew someone must have died. But who? It wasn't that hard to guess, judging by where the van was now strategically parked. Mrs. Nancy Hellenius was polishing the front windows of her 50s-style home. She lived in the property next door to the Rochesters and had a bird's-eye view of their property. Over the years she had grown quite friendly with the Rochesters, so when she noticed the funeral van parked outside their property, her heart sank and she feared the very worst. She found herself gripping the side of the window to steady herself. "Oh, my God, please, no," she said to herself, "not the Rochesters." Nancy took a deep breath, holding it in very tightly, almost as if she was diving under the water, to conserve her energy. She really wanted to pretend to herself she wasn't seeing this inauspicious van in her neighbourhood. It wasn't welcome here. Vans like that were not welcome here. Why didn't it go away and leave the residents of this street alone? Beleaguered, she watched the funeral van reverse in the driveway next door, with the bold gold sign written on its side which read, "Gates of Heaven Funeral Services." Please, she thought, if the gates of heaven looked like that van, I'd run a mile from the pearly gates. I'd be sure I was entering hell, not heaven. Two sombre, very serious-looking men, with melancholia written all over their faces, clad in very smart black suits, wheeled a gurney to the front door of the Queen Anne residence. That was when Nancy saw the tall 6-foot silhouette of Owen Rochester, who would normally stand erect, like a straight pencil in the doorway. But today he was like a twisted tree, hunched over. He gestured for the men to come into the house. His face was ashen. His eyes seemed to look vacant, like empty hollows. Poor man, thought Nancy. Poor, poor man. I'm sure his wife must have died, but she seemed so well. I spoke to her only last week, when she was removing some spring seedlings from the back of her trunk, after a quick visit to the nursery. Her face had been so animated, her smile so bright, her enthusiasm infectious. She had purchased hanging geraniums, petunias, pansies, hollyhocks, and delphiniums. Nancy secretly wondered what could possibly have happened between then and now, for things to lead to such deadly consequences. Did Mrs. Rochester accidentally fall down that rather precarious staircase they owned? Had she broken her neck? She did remember the Rochesters had a very steep staircase, made from polished walnut, that looked a little tricky for an elderly couple to navigate. Or had the woman died of a sudden cardiac arrest? It was possible, although she didn't recall Dorothy Rochester ever complaining of high blood pressure or other complications. Nancy wanted to race over to the Rochester house and to offer the elderly man comfort, but she knew that was an intrusive, rather invasive thing to do, at such a harrowing moment in his life, when you needed to keep your wits about you. Mr. Rochester would need his space to grieve. Nancy forgot about her cleaning the glass windows. The limp rag in her hand became useless, as the desire to pursue her spring cleaning wilted away. She stood there in the window like a dress-shop mannequin, her bleary eyes fixed on the property next door. Her troubled face had grown as white as a sheet, and when she saw a body that was wrapped up in some kind of white cloth being wheeled out of the Rochester residence, she let out a shrill cry. She jumped out of her skin when she heard the echo of the loud scream, only to realise it was coming from the back of her own throat. She could see the withered, deflated expression on poor Mr. Rochester's face. It revealed a broken man. She knew the man had lost his wife, like you know the grass is green and the sky is blue. It was a given. His expression was like an open book, with the words written in bright red on the pages. "My wife is dead. My wife is dead. My wife is dead." A while later, a couple more cars drew up to the opposite side of the Rochesters' house, a station wagon and a white Honda Civic, and there was a flurry of activity. Nancy realised that this must be the couple's two grown-up children, who piled out of their trucks with their children, bustling into the house like a school of sardines. The family looked completely devastated as Nancy noticed puffy cheeks, red eyes, subdued body language, and arms thrown around Mr. Rochester in the doorway, as deflated faces were buried in his shirt. Nancy was sure that his grown-up children were sobbing, crying their hearts out. It was a bleak, sobering picture to have to watch, gnawing at Nancy's heart. Her stomach churned violently. "I hate death," she said under her breath. "I hate it. Why does it have to exist in our lives at all? Why does life have to be so cruel?" Mrs. Rochester did not deserve to die. That was all too apparent. Her fortuitous death had come as a complete surprise to everyone, for Mr. Rochester's family looked visibly shaken, as if someone had thrown a brick into their faces, and they were trying to assimilate the shock. Later that day, when she was shopping in the grocery store in town, Nancy found someone tapping her on the shoulders. She turned around to find it was old Mrs. May Davis. She was shuffling around the store with her basket in her hands. Nancy noticed she had a basket containing black grapes, camembert, cheese, French bread, olives and pickled peppers. "Oh, I thought it was you, dear," she said, opening her purse to bring out a tissue, upon which she began to dab her forehead, as if wiping some sweat away. "You've heard the dreadful news, have you not? It's all around the neighbourhood. But you know, in our street, nothing ever stays quiet for very long. You do know that old Dorothy Rochester is dead? It's so dreadfully tragic. Poor Mr. Rochester. It's him I feel sorry for." Nancy composed herself, straightening out her sweater self-consciously, with one of her hands, as if ironing out invisible creases that didn't exist. It was a quirky habit she always engaged when she was rather nervous, which she tended to do in restaurants, but then she used to turn her attention to the paper serviettes, which she would twist into the shapes of animals, as keeping her fingers busy always settled her angst. "Yes, I gathered as much. Unfortunately, I saw the funeral van parked outside the residence this morning. I knew something terrible had happened, especially when I saw the beleaguered Mr. Rochester up and about, following the body on the gurney, walking back with two men loading it inside. I figured it had to be Dorothy Rochester, and that she was dead. It came as a dreadful shock to me. I only saw her last week, you know. She was telling me all about the seedlings she was putting out for spring, and how she couldn't wait to transform her yard into a blaze of bright colours. And now this. What a dreadful, dreadful shame. And such a lovely woman. I'm still in shock about the news. The Rochesters are so well loved around here. They've been here for over 50 years, you know." May wrinkled up her forehead, so that 2 wrinkles furrowed her brow. She tossed her white cropped hair, that didn't flinch, it was so short. Her eyes squinted at Nancy. "But it's the way they died that really irks me. I mean, it really makes one aware of one's own mortality. I suppose at my advancing age, I'm all too well aware of that now. But I've learned to accept it. But dying that way, and out of the blue like this, with no advanced warning, it's not easy to get my head around. It was so unexpected, so desperately tragic." "Was it a heart attack?" asked Nancy. "Dorothy struck me as so healthy, and as far as I know, she had no issues with blood pressure, cholesterol, or even diabetes." "Oh, heavens, no. You mean you don't know why she died? You do surprise me. You live next door to her. It's around the entire neighbourhood. Would you believe it, she was stung by a bee, of all things? She wasn't even allergic. In the past, when she's had a bee sting, according to her husband, she'd swollen up in that area rather badly, but not very badly, just rather badly. I gather once she was stung on the foot and she couldn't walk on it for an entire week. It had swollen up so much. But this time she was stung on the throat. Mr. Rochester went inside to make them both a cup of tea. They were doing yard work together, planting seedlings. You know what awesome gardeners the both of them are. Dorothy came into the house to say that she'd been stung by a bee, and it was burning her throat, but she judiciously applied some chamomile lotion to soothe away the redness, and promptly returned outside to continue planting. I gather she was relieved it wasn't her foot, where she'd been stung. She was ironically expressing her thankfulness about this, completely unaware that being stung on the throat was 1,000 times worse for her than being stung on the foot. The couple weren't worried about the bee sting, as Dorothy did not consider herself allergic. I gather she went off into the yard to attend to the seedlings in their vegetable patch, and when Mr. Rochester found her, she was lying there dead as a dodo, next to her cabbage seedlings. It would seem her face and throat had swollen up so badly, constricting her airways, she couldn't breathe. I'm not sure why she didn't rush back to the house to get help, but she didn't. I guess she must have felt as if she was being suffocated, poor woman. Maybe she panicked. That's my theory. When you panic, you don't think straight, do you? I guess not. This is dreadful. What an incredulous story. Who knew a bee sting could cause so many complications? And to think there are people out there receiving bee sting therapies for various conditions like multiple sclerosis. Really? Said Mrs. Davis, arching her drawn-on brow. You do surprise me. Then again, nothing surprises me anymore. Aren't some people incredibly odd? And I mean odd. I can't get over this vainglorious, egotistical generation. You know, wanting to upholster themselves with butt implants that are so large you could balance a teacup on your derriere. And what's sexy about that, I ask you? Goldfish lips that need liposuction, breast implants that would make Dolly Parton blush and keep you alive in a shootout, and Botox that can make you look like a lizard, with a face so desperately tight that you have no expression whatsoever on your face. Goodness knows what else. I mean, these days, growing old gracefully has been thrown out with the dirty bathwater. No one wants to do it. The cosmetic industry, I gather, is worth billions. Do you know, my granddaughter told me there's a vampire facial available. Apparently they inject blood from your arms into your face for a younger-looking complexion. And there's a mask that contains bird poop that people pay big bucks to put on their face. When my granddaughter was 12 years old, she climbed the roof to collect the bird droppings to put on her face as a mask. My daughter was absolutely mortified. And now you tell me bee stings are in fashion for a therapy. Hundreds of those stingers being plunged into your skin. Are you kidding me? One is more than enough. What is wrong with people, I ask you? I'd never have multiple bee stings as a therapy. It sounds preposterously insane. Anyway, I'm going off topic here, aren't I? More to the point, it's Mr. Rochester I'm worried about. He and his wife have been inseparable for years. They're like a pair of magnificent shoes that simply must be worn together. When the right shoe is gone, the other shoe loses its ability to function. They need to be a pair. It's like that for so many married couples who finish each other's sentences and know what the other is thinking. The Rochesters are like that. The worst thing about Mrs. Rochester's fortuitous death is that no one saw this coming. And in some ways, those have got to be the worst deaths of all. You can't say goodbye, can you? I remember when I got my dog euthanized, when his back legs collapsed. Poor old Giles. He was 105 years old at the time in dog years. An old sheepdog he was. I prepared him a T-bone steak the day before, spoilt him rotten, gave him a plethora of cuddles and said my goodbyes. But when things leave us without a forewarning, it's gut-wrenching, is it not? So much worse. Couldn't have said it better myself, said Mrs. Davis. Oh dear, is that the time? She said, glancing at the watch. My tongue will run away with me if I'm not careful. I better be off, or my Shih Tzu is not going to be terribly impressed with me. She's waiting for me in the car. When Nancy served up her dinner for her family that evening, she told them the dreadfully sad news. I've got something to tell you all. She passed around the bowl of dressed green salad to complement the piping plates of cheesy lasagna that she'd ladled out. It's very unfortunate news, I'm afraid, but I'm sure you'll be finding out soon enough about it. Nothing stays quiet around here for very long. It's amazing you don't know already. It's buzzing around the neighbourhood like wildfire. James, who was 10, and his younger brother Kyle, who was 8, both stopped eating at once, as they sensed, based on their mother's sorrowful demeanour, that something quite dreadful had transpired. James found his heart began to pound vigorously in his chest. He could feel its jerking, vibrational thuds. The table suddenly grew very still, as 3 pairs of eyes became intensely focused on Nancy. No one was saying a single word, but their rigidly stiff body language revealed that all the listeners were expecting Nancy to tell them some catastrophic news that would burn their ears and bring acid into their stomachs. "What is this about, sweetheart?" her husband Nicholas asked, breaking the silence. "It's our next-door neighbour, Mrs. Rochester. I'm afraid she died. Mr. Rochester kept his deceased wife in the house overnight last night. The funeral van arrived this morning to pick up Dorothy's body in a gurney. I saw the van. I knew something awful had happened. You kids were at school, and of course you, Nicholas, were at work. But I didn't tell you sooner. I was trying to process it all myself. It was so distressing. I can't stop thinking about poor Mr. Rochester. Such a nice man, too. It's desperately sad." "What time did you see the funeral van this morning?" asked Nicholas. "It was about 9:30, I think, or thereabouts. Everything was so quiet on the street. The morning sunshine was so pretty. And I thought I'd do some spring cleaning on the front windows. And that was when I saw the funeral van swinging into the neighbour's house. It gave me quite the shock. For a moment I almost passed out." "Mrs. Rochester is dead?" asked James, his eyes filling with tears. "I liked Mrs. Rochester. She was so nice to us. She often invited us around to her house to give us lemonade and apple pie. She made the best apple pie, the best I've ever tasted, from the apples that she grew in her orchard. It's not fair. Why was it her that had to die?" Nancy knew only too well that her 2 young children were not personally well acquainted with the subject of death, as the only thing that had died on them during the course of their young lives was a blue budgie that they once owned that they called Purple Rain. When Purple Rain had died, it had provoked streams of tears from the 2 of them, and they had prepared a little burial service for Purple Rain, burying him in a white shoebox in the backyard. So it was obvious that the cruel announcement of Mrs. Rochester's untimely demise had really shaken her 2 children to the core. It wasn't easy talking to children about death. Nancy believed in being brutally honest and straightforward about the subject of death, and certainly not candy-coating it. She wanted her children to fully comprehend that death was part of the process of life. Maybe she would read the children the words of wise old King Solomon in Ecclesiasticals. She'd read the chapter which says, "There's a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build." Nancy reached out to give James an encouraging nudge. "It's very sad, James, I know, but people do die. It happens to all of us sooner or later, and sometimes it can catch us off guard when we don't even realise it. That's what happened to poor Mrs. Rochester. No one saw this coming. It was an awful tragedy." "Did she die 'cause she was old, Mummy?" "No, sweetheart. She died because she was stung by a bee, which makes her death all the more dispiriting. It was a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Very unlucky. Like the people that were trapped in the 9/11 building, the tsunami in Thailand, or the Titanic disaster when the ship hit an iceberg. No one saw it coming, you see." James looked astounded. "But I've been stung by bees lots of times. Nothing bad has happened to me." "Well, some people can be allergic to bee stings, sweetheart. Other people, well, they don't react very well. They can have an adverse reaction with lots of swelling. Well, for the vast majority of us, it's moderately uncomfortable, that's all. We all react differently, I suppose. Mrs. Rochester had been stung by bees before. She suffered a great deal of swelling and discomfort, but not much more than that. Unfortunately, she was stung on the throat this time. Her whole face swelled up, constricting her airways, which were quickly blocked. It happened in seconds, I believe, so in a sense you could say she was allergic. If there is any good news about this, I think she didn't suffer. It was over quickly, a little like drowning, I suspect." "Even so," said Nicholas,
I can't imagine what poor Mr. Rochester is going through. He's all alone in the world now, without his lovely wife. God only knows how the poor man is taking it. I imagine he feels as if a wrecking ball has plunged his life into oblivion. I don't know how I would feel if the tables were turned. It would certainly tear me apart.
4 months later, Owen Rochester stared out blankly as he sat in his living room. His heart felt deflated and tired, like some of the worn-out seedlings in the flower pots and flower beds outside his Queen Anne house that his wife had so diligently planted that he had failed to water. They looked how he felt, desperately sad, beleaguered. The living room window overlooked the street, and Owen could watch the comings and goings of the locals. He saw old Mrs. May Davis trudging down the street with her white Shih Tzu at the end of the lead. He knew the dignified, eccentric old woman had lost her husband 5 years ago, but she looked like she was conquering life quite masterfully. Why could he not do that? Why was it so hard to pick up the pieces of his own life that had been sloughed like the paper in a shredder? Maybe he should get a dog from the rescue centre, one as old and tired as he was, he thought. Another living soul in the house might help break up the monotony of his mundane life, and sharing it with an old dog would keep them both in good company, the kind of dog no one else would want, or even dare pick up at the centre because of his age, that would lightly be euthanized. That would be the kind of dog he'd like to save. If he couldn't save his wife, he'd save an old dog, he thought. He'd been hearing the neighbours' kids a lot recently, little James and Kyle, who had loved his wife's apple pie. They wouldn't be popping over for tea again any time soon, he thought. That was now a wistful, nostalgic memory from the past that would never ever be repeated again. Owen could not remember the last time he had genuinely smiled. He had attempted to at the funeral, of course, as he tried to put on a brave, positive face. But none of those robotic smiles had reached his eyes. After Dorothy's fortuitous death, the house had become so desperately silent. The only noise came from the walnut grandfather clock in the hall, sounding every hour, and now its clanging noise was so pronounced it had almost scared him half to death. When Dorothy was around, it had not been so obtrusive. Indeed, a couple of times when it pierced the silence so abruptly, he'd almost jumped out of his skin. Owen realised that losing his wife was the most catastrophic thing that had happened in his life. The funeral had been a small family affair, and for a few days his daughter had moved into the house to help him get over his grief. But how could you ever get over losing your wife? "It'll get better, Dad, I promise," his daughter Kimberly had told him. "There are a lot of people who live alone, you know. Do you know they say in the next generation more than 40% of women will not be married? That's what the stats say. So people are going to have to get used to living alone. If you involve yourself in community events like bowling or golf, you might meet people like yourself. You need to make an effort to be more social, Dad, now that Mummy's not around. That's what she'd want you to do." His well-meaning daughter had been so kind to him, as had so many sincerely considerate people in the neighbourhood, who had dropped by, inquired after him graciously, expressed their extreme regret and sadness over Dorothy's passing, and made him countless casseroles by the truckload. Their generosity had been incredibly touching. After the funeral, life had returned to normal, only it would never be normal again. Without his wife at his side, his life had become vacuously hollow. It had lost all its meaning. So there we are. That's the end of part 1. Part 2 is tomorrow night. And I'm sorry we can't do the whole story. It takes a lot of work to do a whole story, especially when they're very long. And it's putting the story together. It's reading the story. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. So that's why we do it in 2 parts. So until next time, goodbye and good night.